All right, hello everyone. Hope you're having a great day out there, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to turn our audience on to some great theories of everything that you probably have never heard about before, um, kind of ways of seeing the world, different perspectives on how to see the world, and you know, grand unified theories, theories of everything, uh, cosmologies, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and this is our 8th video that we've done on a book that describes the history of um, some of these people, two groups of pretty obscure jazz musicians in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. It's called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this first two chapters cover Sun Ra and the formation of his orchestra. And then then there's a chapter on New York, and then there are 3 chapters on the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians out of Chicago, starting in Chicago. And we are in chapter 2, so we're just just went through in a section toward the end of the section, or the chapter 2 is called orchestration, and this is kind of his praxis of how he approaches forming an orchestra and a big band, and also what he's looking for. Sun Ra's first Chicago groups were formed from very young musicians, often just out of high school. Certainly being snubbed by professional musicians at the Union House and at the Club de Lisa was one factor. But young, unestablished musicians were also more likely to be open to his unconventional ideas. Moreover, many of them required minimal training from Sun Ra because they had just been disciplined in a compatible system at DuSable High School. Discipline was instilled into many black musicians through the Chicago public schools, where students started music lessons in their primary years. Young black children often had a musical appreciation hour in school where they would sit and listen to extended pieces by classical composers. By the time they got to high school, they already had a strong foundation. The greatest of the high school band leaders was Captain Walter Dyett, D-Y-E-T-T, who moved to DuSable High in 1935. Dyett was militaristic, stoic, and professional. Like many famous football and basketball coaches today, Dyett was remembered for his tough love that would straighten kids out by breaking down their ego and then at key moments balance it with a word of praise. Dyett was a race man, but in a disciplinary way, for he was also an antidote for the fantasy world that was so pervasive in show business. When a talented young musician would get local acclaim on the professional scene, Dyett would break him down in front of the class so he wouldn't get a big head. Still, with great affection, he kept up with the accomplishments of his former students. Dyett was like a rite of passage. Once he was through with you, he was your lifelong ally. But while you were under him, it was often unpleasant. One musician described seeing hundreds of episodes of Dyett's breaking his conductor stick over a student's head. It was common to see him humiliate a musician and throw him out of the class. Today, Dyett's practices may seem extreme, but at the time he represented the ideal of professional discipline that many other band leaders also employed. He was old school. Sun Ra was attracted to Dyett's students and vice versa. In comparison to most band leaders, Sun Ra was actually very gentle, even while being strict. James Herndon recalled, "He was the nicest band leader I ever played for." Young musicians liked Sun Ra because he took their ideas and their music seriously. Saxophonist Von Freeman, for example, remembers Sun Ra to be unique among band leaders for allowing musicians to exchange their individual parts if they heard something else. Most important, the creativity of the musician could be quite exciting for a teenager used to playing cliches or standard tunes. Beginning about 1950, Sun Ra played informally and even recorded with dozens of young black musicians who were interested in hearing his music. It was no coincidence that the ones who gravitated most closely to Sonny were those from DuSable. An approximately 36-year-old man, Sonny must have commanded a great deal of authority among drummer Robert Barry and saxophonist Pat Patrick, just out of Captain Diet's high school band. Working with them consistently gave Sun Ra the opportunity to form his own band, starting the Space Trio in 1951. A slightly older John Gilmore, just out of the Air Force, soon made it a quartet. Gilmore, too, had the Diet background to go with the military band experience. He fit in well, having the basic training that Sun Ra demanded of his musicians. These young musicians told their friends, and before too long, he had built up to 8 pieces and often pushed the band up to 11. The musical scheme began with inversion, applicable to the whole complex of Sun Ra's attempt to shock people out of their complacent worldview, described by the terms upside down, inside out, reversal, and back to front. By the late 1950s, Sun Ra was a master of verbal and musical inversion, but it was mysterious to the uninitiated. For example, the black professional musicians in Chicago could read Sun Ra's music, but they couldn't play it. Even the simplest arrangements stumped musicians because, as Ra said, they couldn't feel it. Through musical inversion, the orchestra was able to access a wide range, quote, wide range of emotions you never used before. Sun Ra's music relied upon mysterious processes. In addition to polyrhythms, he had trained his ears to hear overtones and undertones. Because his knowledge came from beyond the margins of accepted thought, even the highly skilled musicians he worked with could not hear or understand his concept. For example, for longtime collaborator John Gilmore, it took more than 6 months of regular practice before he noticed Sun Ra was doing something completely different musically from the other band leaders he had played under. While playing a composition named Saturn, Gilmore finally made the discovery, quote, "I really heard the intervals, and I said, this cat is more stretched out than Monk." That's Thelonious Monk, the bebop pianist. It's unbelievable that anyone could write any meaner intervals than Monk or Mingus, who was a bebop jazz bassist. Mostly bassist. He played the piano too. And great composer. But back to the quote. But he does his intervals, his knowledge of intervals and harmony, very highly advanced. Okay, this section is called musical inversion. Sun Ra's inversions extended to musical history too, while most informed observers assumed otherwise. Sun Ra contended that the birthplace of jazz was not New Orleans, but Birmingham. He cited Lucky Millinder, Jim Europe, Erskine Hawkins, Avery Parrish, and Theodore McCall as creative but disciplinarian orchestrators, who were also gentlemen and race leaders. They were famous among their own people, but because they rarely played in front of whites, they are hardly known to history. Jazz lovers might snicker at Sun Ra's inversion here, but Birmingham was one of the 3 largest cities in the South in that period. It may be that our attention stays focused on New Orleans. but because more of the fast-paced sporting action was there. Not to mention that stronger black control in Birmingham kept the music out of white hands. A similar irony. The class of whites in New Orleans who became attracted to the music were those same adventurers who coined the word jazz in the first place. Jazz, in other words, was the name given to a particular function, not a music. Fittingly, in New Orleans, jazz was otherwise known as whorehouse music. The musical synthesis that took place in Black New Orleans, Birmingham, and other southern cities encompassed much more than bait for whorehouse madams, however. The music was also played at street parades, for funerals, by children on the streets, in the park, at camp meetings, on excursion boats, at gatherings of black social clubs, in dives and honky-tonks, and even in black whorehouses. The syncopated, polyrhythmic music was able to convey such an uplifting, joyful, relaxed, but realistic mood that black bands were always in heavy demand. Does this mean that Birmingham was the center and origin of the music? Maybe not, but it is instructive to hear this perspective to show how even the most axiomatic constructions are in fact disputable. Sun Ra made a strategic alternative construction to generate some dialogue, and then maybe inversion. So instead of worshiping the New Orleans tradition of whorehouses and gambling joints, we can believe in a black music mythology with discipline and precision. For Sun Ra, it was all about mythology, not the facts, but how to use the facts to show us how to live. Sun Ra's inversion was at least plausible enough to make us think about what we had previously assumed. Another musical inversion, not for its immediate applicability, but for its power to refute knowledge, was his discipline of, quote, tone science. Tone science was something like playing without preconceived notion. He wanted the music to arise naturally out of the situation. He asked, "Do you know how many notes are between C and D?" He also claimed to be able to play each note 1,000 different ways. So even if the music is carefully notated, it still has myriad possibilities if one knows tone science. If you deal with those tones, you can play nature, he said. The classical tradition, however, sanctions far fewer correct interpretations of playing than nature. Sun Ra called it mechanical music. Sun Ra's natural music was much more subtle and required a great deal more precision than mechanical music. Phil Coren, a trumpet player, described how Sun Ra commonly wrote music that required trumpet players to jump 2 octaves between eighth notes. Similarly, Gilmore, a saxophonist, claimed that some of Sun Ra's music was so difficult to play that you would bust your hands just getting to the notes. Sun Ra's music carried an implicit sacrifice. Before he could proceed with tone science, though, he needed to invert. For one, Sun Ra used the well-known practice of chord inversion. An inverted chord is tricky because it sounds correct, but is just a little different. For example, a C chord includes C, E, G, while an inverted C chord still makes the sound of C, but higher, E, C, G. Second inversion, G, C, E. In this way, Sun Ra could play music that sounded almost correct, but it was actually inverted. Inverting the concept of notation even more was Sun Ra's conception of rhythm. He developed the ability to play polyrhythms by himself, in different rhythms with each hand, making the music so complex that writing it down often made it harder rather than easier to play. Sometimes Sun Ra would play in an unorthodox rhythm like 7/4 with his left hand while alternating between 5/4 and 3/4 in the right. Notating such things according to convention was counterproductive. Instead, he believed that the music should be taught orally. The text of the music could be read only by those who had been taught orally how to play it. Therefore, for those who hadn't the oral instructions, the compositions themselves could be indecipherable. When discussing the obscurantism of one composition, he explained, quote, "Can't tell you what key it's in either. Although it seems to be in a certain key when you write it, then you're not satisfied because it's intangible." In the swing era, written music became a prerequisite due to the instability of band members. In swing, written music became the common language, replacing the ear learning that came from an apprenticeship system and the long-term familiarity of early bands. In swing, the most professional musicians became those with the most advanced reading skills. But Sun Ra's music would confound even those crack professional musicians, readers who could read, quote, fly specs, until they were taught the oral keys to unlock his music. Fletcher Henderson was unable to teach his band how to play it in Sonny's absence. Coleman Hawkins, one of the canonically all-time great tenor saxophonists of jazz, first encountered Sun Ra at the Club de Lisa in 1946. Decades later, Hawkins, seeing Ra, declared him the only person who ever gave me music that I couldn't play. Making this code even harder to break was the fact that Sun Ra wrote music for individual players, especially as he began to build a band. Also, each composition was unique. Its value for copying was often nullified without him at the keyboard because no one can play like me. In short, the good news is that Sun Ra left behind several thousand compositions that have never been heard before. The bad news is that even if we tried, they will lose much of their brilliance when they are reinterpreted, even if they can be interpreted at all. Through inversion, Sun Ra shook up our beliefs about musical notation. In one sense, Sun Ra's language of inversion was a form of conscientious objection. He saw the music as a universal language for healing and survival. It therefore could not be continued to be used as bait for the consumption agenda of institutional arrangement and recording. There was too much at stake to cooperate with this. So Sun Ra refused to comply and even fought back through the process of inversion. By inverting standard music and working from there, listeners could still hear the song, but the nonverbal message would be inverted. In the 1950s, Sun Ra's music looked and even sounded close to other bebop music of the day, but it felt subtly different, and the differences could be heard if you pay attention to it. Sun Ra's own discipline was defined by patience. He knew his message, at first, must be spread face to face, one person at a time. He also knew it would be years before he achieved any of his interplanetary mission's goals. He explained in retrospect, "I've played the low profile in that I had to develop myself because so many people have come along and want to teach humanity and do something for them, and they failed because they didn't take long enough to develop themselves, rise themselves up on a higher spiritual level where they'd be strong enough spiritually to do things despite the discouragement of everyday life." Sun Ra persevered and held a band together for more than 40 years. Amazingly, he also inspired some individual members to stay with him for the duration. While most musicians pursued fame and fortune, Sun Ra's musicians were quite loyal, even in obscurity. The space the orchestra occupied was separate from white society, separate from the black mainstream, even separate from the black separatists. He called himself the boss of the sub-underground. Before the orchestra moved out of the city in 1960, few Chicagoans had ever heard of Sonny or his orchestra. His time in Chicago functioned primarily as a training period to prepare his disciples for their difficult mission of propagating the Creator's higher message to the people of Earth. Sun Ra's patience was notable because it made the orchestra the epitome of an underground group within the black community. Several other cabals the Moors, Muslims, and peace mission all ran into scandals and dissension that undermined their movements. Sun Ra, with his exacting prerequisites, was able to keep a small core group of disciples together over extended periods. While other groups broke up, Sun Ra's strategic use of discipline and inverted music allowed him to retain near total control. Because of the orchestra's longevity and its determination to document the creator's message in music, Sunny's orchestration can serve as a model for those attempting to sustain contact with their higher selves. Spoiler alert is that, I mentioned that some of his early band members stayed with him for the duration, like 40 years. Marshall Allen was his alto sax and flute player. One of his alto sax and flute players joined the band in like 1958, I believe. He's in that picture that's on the thumbnail for this video, the alto player. And when Sun Ra passed away, left the planet in 1993, John Gilmore took over the band briefly until he passed in 1995 or so. And I believe since then the band has been led by Marshall Allen, and he, I believe, just turned 100 years old in May, and he's still leading the band. So he's been, he's been in the Sun Ra Orchestra since 1958. Okay, let's start this next section. It's called verbal inversion. Increasingly, in the 1950s, Sun Ra began to use verbal as well as musical inversion. Sun Ra's inversion was very radical, but it can be understood if placed in a Kabbalistic context. The science of word magic goes back to the Kabbalah and other ancient creation tales. Among early Kabbalists, some believed that the Hebrew alphabet's letters were sacred emanations from God, or YHWH. These mystical students of the Bible assign special significance to the sounds of these words of power. Through the generations, Kabbalists were able to develop these concepts until many words and phrases were said to be able to produce physical manifestations. In modern times, the science of word magic was still alive in Black Chicago, as Captain Diet's example shows. Significantly, Diet was a metaphysician. He ascribed a hidden in time power to thought. Diet knew music, but what made him special was his understanding of the psychology of programming. He would commonly write on the board, right thoughts produce right actions, wrong thoughts produce wrong actions. But more than anything, he understood the idea that through repetition, one could transfer knowledge from the mind onto the body, from the intellect, the conscious, to the automatic, the subconscious. From there, it was only a matter of confidence for the musician to let the automatic take over. We do this with human activities like walking, typing, and talking. It took us months or years to learn them, but now they come naturally. Still, the minute we begin to think about them, they become more difficult and we often lose our balance or rhythm. Diet and other disciplinarians use these same principles with music. Diet's metaphysics were Kabbalistic in nature. One musician recalls that, quote, he was the main reason I became involved with the Rosicrucians. For musicians familiar with Diet, Sun Ra extended the teachings, using esoteric texts, etymological tracts, and of course several versions of the Bible. Sun Ra was able to determine that some of these secret verbal powers were still in effect, in English, but often in reverse. Quote, after Babylon, there was confusion in the languages, and after that, Jesus turned everything upside down. end quote. He believed that many of the negative vibrations in the air could be cured by their inversion, the antidote, verbally and with music. Ra's musical inversions have been more notable because they have been more accessible. Words were more conspicuous in this verbal society, and Sun Ra's word content was often so obviously beyond the margins that even his musical fans refrained from taking his pronouncement seriously. Indeed, the idea of extraterrestrials and communication with deities from beyond were enough to classify anything he said beyond the boundaries of respectable debate in the 1950s. Regardless of whether it was musical or verbal, Sun Ra was a virtuoso of inversion, but the musical inversion was potentially more powerful, for when he played music, he had a whole band backing him. Still, the accompanying verbal inversion could have a destabilizing, decentering effect. Here we will examine a few of his verbal inversions that are more easily translated in an academic context. From biblical research, he felt that, quote, the people who have the Bible are using it in the wrong way because they don't understand. But the Bible says God is the cause of confusion, that he confused the languages at the Tower of Babel. That's what it says. In an attempt to decipher, Sun Ra believed that words were components of, quote, equations. Like chemicals, words could be put together in certain configurations that created certain effects. A wordologist would proceed just as a scientist would take chemicals and put them together and get a reaction, or as a musician would put notes together. Sun Ra believed that, quote, words you put together, you will get reactions, but you have to do it at the right place. For every group of words, there was another group that, through repetition, could nullify the first. Sun Ra believed that because of the biblical inversion, the first shall be last and the last shall be first, humans stood at the brink of a collapse. Quote, everything they think is right, that will be nullified too, but everything has to be nullified for them or else they're going to die. For years, he searched for the verbal combinations that reversed the conventional language. And at the same time, he was developing a mostly nonverbal music that could replace the worldviews of repetition and representation once they collapsed. Often, Ra contended that it was about 1 minute to midnight for this planet because, quote, these equations are about to kill you unless you get some other ones. He added, they follow in the wrong words. They are putting these words together and they're making slight errors in spelling, pronunciation, and interpretation, and in definition of words. Similarly, a lot of people gone crazy studying the Bible, and that's because of the duplicity. I'm giving my equations. I'm trying to find out how people were created, how it was done, and how to undo the knot. First, a look at some typical kinds of equations is necessary. This is kind of gets into something that I don't want to really split up. So I'm going to stop right here and maybe go back a paragraph before proceeding tomorrow when we start up again. So thanks for tuning in today. Have a great